Okay, so if there's one thing that we've learned in the last 3 years, it's that nearly anything can become politicized, whether that be public health policy, vaccination, brand consumption, or even our personal identities themselves. I'm Noah Laskey, and I'm deeply interested in this matter of politics being taken really personally, and I'd like to give an example. Imagine that you and I are engaged in a political discussion, and being a conservative is really central to who I am. Now, that's going to really complicate the discussion because we're no longer just discussing policy optimization, but instead we're really kind of debating the validity of my identity, and it seems like that could really give rise to some pretty problematic conflicts. So I'm just really interested in how is this manifesting in our political sphere and how is it affecting how we sort of interact with one another. So one framework to look at this problem through is this theory, identity fusion theory. So essentially it draws on the basic distinction between group and personal identity. So traditionally we see identity as a combination of our group memberships and our personal characteristics. And then on identity fusion, basically there are some cases where these two categories become really undifferentiated, where I have a hard time seeing the distinction between my group successes and my own. And I really see conservatism as who I am. It's so central to my identity. And in other contexts outside of the political, basically this has led to really high levels of extremism. And also it seems like once people sort of adopt these identities, they have a really hard time sort of relinquishing them. So it seems like it could have some major and problematic implications in political context. But despite this, it's been sort of understudied. There are some data that indicate that identity fusion with President Trump, for example, leads to sort of anti-democratic aggression and outgroup prejudice, sort of dislike for the other. And similarly, some have found that this strong fusion sort of leads to willingness to make sacrifices on behalf of one's political party, monetarily speaking. But a lot of this research on political aggression and sort of outgroup prejudice tends to focus more on right-wing identities and sort of ignores the left side of the aisle. So one of the major research questions of mine was whether or not this phenomenon sort of generalizes across the ideological divide. Just to give an example, it does seem indeed that there are some cases where both left and right-wing groups are sort of engaging in this intense pro-group behavior. Consider sort of the Proud Boys versus Antifa conflicts in Portland that were sort of raging around 2016. We can at least imagine some examples where there are left and right-wing manifestations of this intense identity fusion where we're willing to make these sacrifices on behalf of our groups. And another question that's sort of unaddressed is whether or not this identity fusion phenomenon links up with authoritarianism. By authoritarianism, I essentially mean sort of this desire for in-group conformity and the desire to impose one's values onto the other. And like the identity fusion literature, a lot of the authoritarianism research is focused on these right-wing manifestations. So we all know there's 1,000 studies on right-wing authoritarianism, but pretty recently people have started to take this left-wing authoritarianism more seriously as an empirical question. And indeed, both right and left-wing authoritarianism seem to be linked up with this outgroup prejudice and sort of this intolerance for the other. So given that both of these constructs, identity fusion and authoritarianism, seem to both line up with this intense partisanship, pro-group commitment, and this tendency to sort of be intolerant or to desire sort of ideological homogeneity in their field of experience. Another question that I had was whether or not fusion would sort of link up with this authoritarianism. So yeah, basically my research was interested in addressing both of these questions. One, namely whether or not fusion was linked up with pro-group activism or pro-group behavior, and whether that was going to emerge on either side of the ideological divide, and even when controlling for basic I lean left or I lean right. And then essentially the same for authoritarian attitudes, whether fusion was going to lead to this authoritarianism, even when controlling for that basic identification. So on to our methods. We just had digital participants recruited through sort of these recruitment services like Prolific and Cloud Research. The first study was a demographically representative sample of United States citizens, 850 people, and that was through Prolific. And then the second was a convenience sample of American participants, again, recruited through Cloud Research. For those of you struggling with that major left-wing skew, Cloud Research didn't seem to be quite as bad for this. We actually had at least a bit more of an even distribution. This is study 2, of course. Study 1 was quota sampled. So yeah, and then for this identity fusion, I'm not sure how many of you have read papers on identity fusion, but the sort of canonical measure is this pictorial measure where participants are sort of given an opportunity to show the degree to which their smaller self-identity, which is the small circle, is subsumed by the broader group identity. So they're basically going to show how central that is to who they are. And then in the second study, we also kind of wanted to corroborate this. So we also used this verbal scale, this identity fusion. So an example item would be like conservatism is who I am. The successes of conservatism are my own successes. I have a deep emotional bond with my fellow conservatives, and I'd feel ashamed if there were a scandal involving a conservative leader. So yeah, that brings us to the pro-group attitudes measures. So the first one being sympathies for violent protests. We sort of thought this would line up more with left-wing manifestations of extreme pro-group behavior because left-wingers tend to have more sympathies for protest movements. And then for a right-wing manifestation, we decided to use this measure of ethnocentrism. So yeah, for the sympathies for violent protests, an example item was it's acceptable to use violence in political protests. And then for ethnocentrism, an example was I believe in the superiority of my ethnic group. And then in study 2, we used this more general measure of activism that we thought was going to map more generally across the ideological divide. It's a bit more politically neutral, but an example would be I could see myself participating in a protest or demonstration. And then for authoritarianism, across both studies, we used really traditional measures of right-wing authoritarianism and in my view, the best measure available of left-wing authoritarianism. An example on the right was we need a strong leader who will crush evil and take us back to our true path. And then for left-wing authoritarianism, an example was the old-fashioned ways and old-fashioned values need to be abolished. And then we also used this unique and novel measure of general authoritarianism that has nonpartisan content. An example was it's justified to force people to see things the right way. So yeah, that brings us to our results. In the first study, we did indeed find that even when controlling for basic ideological orientation, right-wing fusion was predicting ethnocentrism, and similarly, left-wing fusion was predicting the sympathies for violent protests. And then in our second study, we also found the same, where right-wing fusion was predicting activism, even when controlling for right-wing political orientation, and the same for left-wing fusion. Interestingly enough, you'll see that the relationship between basic I lean right on the ideological scale is negatively predicting activism. So it seems like if you're just kind of, I'm on the right, but it's not very central to who I am, not very inclined towards activism, but people who are like, yeah, this is who I am, then you're gonna see that sort of positive relationship, which is pretty interesting. And then for authoritarianism, across both studies, this is using, whether the pictorial or the verbal scale of identity fusion, we're finding these really strong and clean relationships between fusion and authoritarianism, even when controlling for that basic political orientation. But more interestingly, in my view, is this nonpartisan measure of authoritarianism that's actually capturing this relationship with fusion on the left wing and the right wing, and even when controlling for that basic ideological orientation. Interestingly, on the left side of the divide here, we're sort of seeing a similar trend as right-wingers had with activism, where people who are, yeah, I'm on the left, but it's not really central to who I am, they're not particularly authoritarianism, or not particularly authoritarian in the general sense, but when it is really central to their identities, they do tend to have sort of this desire to impose their values on the other. So that really just brings us to the discussion. Essentially, we found pretty unequivocal support for both predictions that that political fusion is sort of leading to this intense pro-group behavior and sort of the tendency to behave in an activist fashion on behalf of one's ideology, even when controlling for that basic identification, sort of showing the uniqueness of fusion in predicting those outcomes. And then also that indeed identity fusion, whether it's on the left or the right, does seem to be linked up with authoritarianism in a way that can't just be captured by basic ideological leaning. So yeah, in terms of theoretical contributions, the first contribution we made was essentially that it's a pretty strong vindication of identity fusion theory in political contexts, but also extending it across the ideological divide. Doesn't seem like it's specific to the left or specific to the right, but it's sort of something that happens regardless of your ideology. And this sort of speaks to this ongoing debate of rigidity of the right versus rigidity of the extremes, whether it's, is it one ideology that's specifically malignant and dangerous to our societies, or is it just the extremes that are sort of more similar to one another than they are to the people in the middle? Our research is essentially in support of the former, where, basically the extremes are more similar to each other, and there's not something specific about right-wingers that makes them extremely dangerous, although there might be some asymmetry in that curvilinear relationship. So One of the clearest limitations is that these are correlational studies, so we can't, although in theory we can speculate that, yeah, fusion leads to authoritarianism, we don't necessarily know whether one temporally precedes the other. And it's also important to keep in mind that the American context is, of course, quite unique, so we don't know for sure whether or not this would generalize cleanly to other contexts. And so yeah, that sort of leads us to future directions. Of course, it's going to be really important to figure out whether or not fusion precedes authoritarianism, or whether people that sort of have an authoritarian disposition are more likely to just organize themselves into these like identity-based groups and then sort of battle it out from there. And I think it's also really important to determine some paths towards defusion, given that it does seem to be a robust predictor of extremism, and it's sort of seems damaging to our political discourse. Ultimately, it would be nice if we could quit confusing who we are with who we vote for. Thank you so much.